Hello, and welcome back to my channel. This is my first video after I took a month plus long break for NaNoWriMo, and I'm happy and excited to be back making videos today. I'm going to be discussing this wonderful book which I recently mentioned in one of my community posts by Sam Kean, The Icepick Surgeon, Murder, Fraud, Sabotage, Piracy, and Other Dastardly Deeds Perpetrated in the Name of Science. It was just such an awesome book, and because today, the day I'm filming this, the 8th of December, is John Lennon's 42nd yahrzeit death anniversary. I'm dressed all in black and wearing my little dove necklace because he was all about peace. It's hard to believe he's been gone for so long, or that I've now outlived him by almost 3 years. But anyway, let's just get down with the review. The book starts with a possibly apocryphal story about Cleopatra, with the author acknowledges might have just been propaganda made up to demonize a powerful woman in history. What else is new? Like women like Cleopatra and Queen Jezebel, they just made men uncomfortable because of their power. And so anyway, Cleopatra wanted to do a little scientific experiment, and she technically did everything right, in terms of science, but she did everything wrong in terms of ethics, according to the story. And she wanted to see when you could determine whether a fetus was male or female. And so she took this very, very seriously. If a maidservant of hers was already pregnant, obviously it couldn't work because she wanted to monitor the pregnancy from the very beginning. So she would have the maid drink an abortifacient so she could lose her pregnancy, have a miscarriage, and then she would this is a horrible, horrible story if it's true. She would arrange to have these maids raped by manservants so she could monitor the pregnancy from the jump, and then after a certain point she would tear open the maidservant's midsection and examine the fetus, and she just kept doing this to see, oh, when is the earliest possible I can tell her, by what point is it totally obvious. And according to the folktale, she could determine the sex by day 41, but obviously, as I mentioned, this just might be propaganda to demonize a powerful woman, because there aren't really any legitimate historical documentary evidence of this. It's just a couple of apocryphal things here and there. And also modern science, we know sex cannot be determined at 6 weeks. Usually it's about the 20-week scan, I believe. The first chapter is about a really, really colorful figure I don't believe I had ever heard about before. I was really interested and really happy to learn about this really cool dude. This was William Dumpy, who lived from 1651 until 1715. He was a naturalist who became a pirate because of various events and situations and circumstances kind of compelled him to this throughout his life. I'm not going to obviously give a full blow detailed account of all these characters, but I'm just going to give a short summary cliff notes. And so he, among the many, many wonderful things he did, he wrote lots of books about things he discovered. Particularly, he kept a really detailed journal. And this was in an era you couldn't just type on the computer, your typewriter, or even do a regular fountain pen or ballpoint pen. He had to do a quill and the ink and sharpen it all the time. And he's keeping these really, really daily detailed notes throughout many decades of his life. And so anyway, he had the first detailed meteorological account of a hurricane, and he took extensive notes and samples of flora and fauna when he was going around South America and the Caribbean and places like that. But unfortunately, his luck went downhill at one point. He lost most of his specimens in a horrible shipwreck, and then he was convicted of a felony for beating another sailor. And this other sailor was alleged, according to Dumpy at least, trying to ruin his reputation. It was just a whole sordid scandal. Dumpy was assured, oh, he would be totally cleared because he was this world renowned naturalist, and everyone liked and respected him as a sailor and just things like that. And this other guy was just this horrible heel trying to ruin him. But the tables were turned, although obviously he did try to redeem himself throughout the rest of his life. But he did have to return to piracy again. And the author throughout the book, he ties this into other accounts of very similar stories and characters. And he says scientific piracy continues to this day. And he gives the example of trying to harvest the quinine plant in the South America and Central America, because malaria it still is a horrible disease, but even in those days it was even worse without modern medicine. So people were trying to do all sorts of piracy things to harvest the quinine and get it to as many people as possible, even if it was ethically dubious what they were doing. I bookmarked a particularly colorful thing about Dumpy. Just really, really does a great job of illustrating just what kinds of things he was doing. After his stint in Sumatra, Dumpy gave the first account in English of ganja, or marijuana. Some it keeps sleepy, some merry, some putting them into a laughing fit, and others it makes mad. He described a mass circumcision of 12-year-olds in the Philippines, and how they went straddling for a fortnight after. He also covered tattooing in Polynesia and foot-binding in China, which he denounced as a mere stratagem of the men to hobble women and keep them indoors. Upon hearing a local legend in the West Indies, he He ate a dozen pickle pears at once and delighted to see that they really did turn his urine red. Nearly 1,000 citations in the Oxford English Dictionary trace back to his writings, and he introduced dozens of words into English, including banana, posse, smugglers, tortilla, avocado, cashews, and chopsticks. There was plenty of science, too. Even today, Dampier remains unsurpassed as a pure observer of nature. Compared to his, other accounts of flora and fauna seem lifeless, like a glass-eyed taxidermy lion compared to the real, leaping, roaring beast. Part of the vividness sprang from Dampier's use of all five senses, including taste. The man never met an animal he didn't eat. Flamingo tongues, he reported, have a large knob of fat at the root, which is an excellent bit. A dish of flamingo's tongue being fit for a prince's table. He cooked up manatee veal and iguana soup and turtle oil dumplings, along with dozens of other outre recipes. And if all that got your mouth watering, well, Dampier could snatch your appetite away just as quickly. In one revolting section, he popped a worm cyst on his leg, drew out the slimy sucker inch by agonizing inch. He also detailed, my apologies in advance, one of the most epic bouts of diarrhea ever recorded in the annals of English literature. His attack started after seeking treatment for a fever, when he was persuaded to take a local physic to purge his bowels. Bad idea. He had the trots on and off for a year, and sometimes endured 30 bowel movements in a single sitting till he was more or less dry heaving out his ass. No one ever said field work was glamorous. The next story is about Henry Smithman, who lived from 1742 until 1786, and this was a naturalist who worked in Africa, and he got involved with slavers and slaves to further his scientific research, despite his initial disgust and horror, both at the slave trade itself and the guys who were actually doing it, and kidnapping these people from Africa and shipping them all over the world, or making them work on their own little plantations or estates as colonialists in Africa. And this is kind of a gross detail to me. When he was 30 years old, he married a 13-year-old who was the daughter of a chief, and the author saying, oh, he mooned over his wife and absolutely loved her, unlike other guys who just looked at their African slave wives they took to further their powers, oh, this is just an object. But it's totally creepy. Even in the era, a 30-year-old should not be having sex with, marrying a 13-year-old. But anyway, but he allegedly, according to the author and the Smithman's own accounts, he did love this woman, even though in the present we would view that with absolute horror. And so anyway, this opened up even more opportunities for him to use slave labor now that he was the son-in-law of a powerful chieftain. And the thing he is most known for today is an extensive study of termites and their mounds. It might sound kind of boring to people, but this was absolutely fascinating research. I mean, he did a lot of fascinating, really cool discoveries about this. And this author leads us into a very related story about an African naturalist, a slave called Quasi, and he helped the colonizers, and his own people were really, really unhappy about what he was doing, because he was constantly stabbing him in the back. There's a kind of a phrase some people considered controversial that could absolutely be applied to him. The initials are UT, if you know what that stands for, and there's also a shrub named for him. The next story is about dissecting bodies for anatomical research in the eras before medical schools could have really good access to corpses for scientific purposes. It was totally outlawed by the church and the laws in England, although I was surprised to learn this was never really outlawed in continental Europe, either under secular law or by Catholic church law, even though many people have this idea, people were getting arrested for alleged witchcraft if they were caught, cutting up bodies if they were medical students. So that was, a bit of an urban legend. So it opens with the story of William Hare and William Burke, who started murdering boarding house tenants and selling them to an anatomist named Robert Knox, and they were eventually busted. It was a whole sordid tale, and they didn't set out to start murdering people on purpose. There was just one person who died there, and all these tenants happen to be old and sick. They're not going to be long for this world anyway. Let's just put them out of their misery by murdering them and getting a little bit of money by using it for scientific research. So their death and murder isn't totally in vain. There was even a whole noun birthed from the particular method they would use to do their little perfect crime called burking, and they would one of them would smother the face and chest with the pillow, and the other one would smother the face, and the other one was basically sitting on the chest. But they knew they couldn't strangle the person, because that would leave not only marks on the neck, but it would crush the bones, and that would be a telltale sign pointing right back to them, and they would get busted a lot sooner. So they figured out how to leave the hyoid bone and the neck intact. So it was the perfect crime until they got busted. And the chapter also talks about an anatomist named John Hunter. I bookmarked a thing about him. He absolutely loved dissection, and one of this really like horrible things he did, he stole the body of an Irish giant named Charles Byrne. Like he told him, "Oh, dude, when you're dead, I would love to like study your like organs and your skeleton." And Byrne was absolutely horrified. He didn't want this to happen at all, and he like went through this big production after he was dead. Like his friends were all guarding his coffin as it was making its way to the final resting place, being buried at sea, which is also where I went to go at the end of my days. But unfortunately, along that route, Hunter made a little like switcheroo with the coffin. He like made off with the body, and he like loaded up the real coffin with like rocks. So just a bunch of rocks went into the ocean. That was just absolutely like horrible. These like anatomists, they were like totally like going above and beyond in their pursuit of science, and totally forgetting about basic ethics. And this is what I bookmarked about like some of what Hunter was doing. Hunter's obsession took two forms. First, he loved anatomy for its own sake, not just human anatomy. He carved up thousands of animals too, including outre bits like sparrows' testicles, bees' ovaria, and monkey placenta. He even collaborated with Henry Smithman in dissecting his grotesque termite queens. Second, Hunter saw anatomy as a way to reform medicine. Medicine in that era paid lip service to things like observation and experiment, but everyday treatment still consisted of hoary nostrums like purging, bloodletting, and tobacco enemas, literally blowing smoke up someone's ass. Hunter wanted to modernize medicine and saw anatomy as a foundation of reform. To cure disease, doctors needed intimate knowledge of the body. To him, this included not just how the parts fit together, but the feel and smell and even taste of different tissues. He once described the gastric juices of cadavers as saltish or brackish. More daringly, he reported that semen, when held some time in the mouth, produces a warmth similar to spices. Hunter even dissected and tasted an Egyptian mummy. And if you're wondering, one of the like things I most remember from my freshman year of college zoology class, the professor said it's pronounced dissection or dissect. It's not dissect because like the way it's formed from different roots. And he also taught us the proper pronunciation of zoology. If it were pronounced zoology, it would have to have three O's in it. And that's just like so one of the little fun details I remember from my zoology class. He was an awesome professor. The next chapter is about Dr. George Parkman, who mysteriously went missing because of like a little rivalry and things like that. And he was killed by Dr. John White Webster of Harvard in 1849. Eventually, they originally had suspected the janitor who discovered the body in the latrine because you're like, oh, you found it, you must be the one who did it. But obviously, other clues eventually led to the right suspect being fingered and being convicted in court, which was a huge shock to people at the time. Particularly, this was like a totally classist siding. Oh, a Harvard man couldn't do that. And, this was like when Harvard was like only like rich WASP men were like getting into Harvard at all. That's a whole other story. And anyway, he was like busted by like forensic analysis of the bones, and this like really started to lead forensic analysis of bodies and like remains into the modern era, because before that it was basically just like guesswork. Oh, maybe it was this, or oh, these teeth look like this. But the author does say later in the book a lot of like modern forensics still is like largely guesswork, apart from obviously stuff like DNA. Then we get into the story of a rivalry between Thomas Edison, whom like probably everyone knows who he is. I don't really have to give it like a summary, versus George Westinghouse. It was the battle of the currents. Like one of them thought applied current, AC, would work much better than like DC, direct current. And so like to do this, Edison like murdered animals. He obviously didn't want to test on people first. That would be just a bridge too far. But like animals, it's totally okay to murder them in my little test. And eventually he killed 44 dogs, 6 calves, 2 horses, and like eventually he like recorded an elephant electrocution in 1903. That I have seen this film. It's on my list of silent film scene. It's really, really difficult to watch. And elephant electrocutions were perhaps to many people in the modern era surprisingly common back in these days. Particularly, if they like turned on someone at the circus, they would like, oh, you have to murder that elephant, instead of thinking, oh, maybe this elephant is just like really like depressed and stressed out from being forced to perform these like stupid little tricks for people in the circus. So they just like went right to electrocuting. And eventually Edison did move up to using a human lab rat for his little test with the first electric chair murder. This was William Kemmler, and he had like a long, botched, painful death, and he was sentenced to the death penalty because he had murdered his wife Tilly in 1889. And at the time he said, oh, I'm ready for the rope, because he assumed they would like hang him. Like that was still like common practice in many states and countries which had the death penalty, but they wanted to do a so-called more modern, humane form of the death penalty, and that is one of a handful, very, very rare conservative political views I have. I do support the death penalty. That's a long story. But anyway, that was just a horrible, horrible way for this first person to die. And the author's suspecting maybe it didn't work because he was so calm about it. If he'd been like sweating from fear, there would have been more like natural like conduction from like the sweat all over his body, and just like many, many other things that went wrong. They had to apply it over and over and over again for really, really long periods and keep like, reattaching the currents. It's just like absolutely a horrible, horrible way to die. Although obviously it wasn't nice at all, to say the least, how he like murdered his wife. So I guess he obviously did deserve the death penalty because he had murdered his wife. Then we get to a really interesting story of the dinosaur bone wars with Edward Drinker Cope versus Othniel Charles Marsh. And like they were like rivals for decades, and they absolutely loved dinosaurs and like anthropology, like paleontology, stuff like that. But they just didn't want to let the other guy get the credit. Oh, you're like too low class, or you're too like snobby and stuck up, so I'm gonna like ban you from my dig site, or like sneak back to your dig site after you and your like guys have gone home for the evening. I'll dig up more bones and I won't tell you about it, or I'll prevent you from publishing in journals, or I'll start my own scientific journal so I don't have this like gag order on publishing whatever I want to like trash you in the press. And just like really, really interesting, colorful tales like that. And the one particularly funny thing, Cope he originally saw this dinosaur and like, oh, wow, look at this tail. This is dozens of feet long. And like, it turns out, like Marsh said, oh, dude, you inverted the vertebrae. And he like basically put the head on what he, thought was like the back of the tail. Like the back of the tail was actually the base of the skull. And like, it was like a totally humiliating thing for him. And he wanted all these like journals and articles that had do this like amazing new discovery, like banned or like taken out of circulation and burned. But the other guy, he bought them all up and like reminded him of it again in print like many years later. It was just like a really like cool, fun like rivalry. I just love the continuity when these people, they're just like feuding for decades. It's just like fun to read about. But also, like, to his credit, Marsh was a wonderful, wonderful Native American ally. He did a lot of like good things for him. They thought, oh, he's just paying a white man paying us lip service. He's not really going to do this when he goes back to Washington. But he totally kept his word. He went above and beyond. He was like absolutely so good to their people. Then we get into Nazi science, which obviously a total minefield. They it goes without saying they were violating like so many things like about basic like scientific and ethical integrity, not to mention the basic Hippocratic oath. But as the author points out, some of these like experiments are the only data we have on some of these things, like for example hypothermia, or like the drinking seawater. And they like, well, obviously ethically they did it wrong, but scientifically they did some things right. Like for example, people don't want to drink seawater, so they would kind of like disguise the taste so they would be like less reticent to do it. And they just like recorded it like very seriously. And like it brings up the question of, should we use the results of these studies and anything at all, like regardless of what the outcome was, or even if this might be useful, like for example like high like altitude pressure on pilots going way up into like outer space, or high up in the atmosphere, like hypothermia, or drinking seawater, all these other things like that. Although obviously some things shouldn't be considered at all, because like what use do they have in legitimate science, like sewing people together, all like garbage like that. And this leads into the Tuskegee experiment, which many people misinterpret this. They think these black guys were deliberately infected with syphilis. No, they already had syphilis. They just weren't treated for it, and they were monitored over many decades. But this was like obviously in ethical terms it was a horrible experiment, but many other ways it was bad, because some of them were lost to the study over time. They just stopped checking up. They got suspicious, or maybe they like moved away, or sometimes they would like go to a doctor to get treatment like outside of the study, or sometimes they would go to a doctor for something else and end up getting like a drug that would help them. And just like so many other factors that meant this experiment was garbage beyond the obviously ethical stuff. And this also he mentions as something very related as well to do with these STD experiments in Guatemala. These first, this guy was like trying to like study like gonorrhea and chlamydia and stuff like that. So he deliberately infected the prisoners by like basically like smearing it on himself, which is like, you think your job is bad, the author said, and that really wasn't working at all. And so like later he invited prostitutes into the jail, and he would like voyeuristically watch them having sex. Like right after they finished, he would like zoom right in there and basically like look at their crotches and like take the like fluids and stuff to like do in the experiment. And that still wasn't working. And so he tried even more invasive ways of deliberately infecting people, so he could like determine, oh, who's getting an STD and who isn't, and how can I treat them and cure them after this. And like eventually he turned his life around and did a lot of good things for women's health, and like he was a very good champion like during the AIDS crisis. He said, like gay men are not evil or sinners and they deserve to be helped when this like horrible plague is like killing so many of them. So, even if you might have an unethical start in your like doctor, your scientific life, you might turn it all around at the end, and these like things can contradictorily exist within all the same person. The next chapter is about lobotomies, which were pioneered and invented by Agaz Moniz and Walter Freeman. I shouldn't really have to do much detail about this. We all pretty much know what lobotomies are. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Oh, these like mental patients or people who are wild or out of control. Oh, just like remove some of their brain and they'll go back to normal. But unfortunately, this didn't really work at all. A lot of them like regressed and became even worse, or some at best maybe they just wouldn't work at all. It was horrible thing. Like eventually a number of countries started banning lobotomies, but did we really come far, because we don't really still have a lot of good treatment for mental health. It's one of the last few remaining stigmas. And then like basically we don't really have like insane asylums anymore. I mean, like Bedlam and stuff like that was obviously like horrible, like crimes against like the mentally ill. But we should have had like a happy medium between like chaining them to the walls and like institutionalizing people for the least little thing. Even like, for example, like many women can be institutionalized if the husband or the father said, oh, she's reading too many novels or using her brain too much. Oh, she's not like happy clappy right after giving birth. So, oh, postpartum depression, that must be like insanity. Like give her the electric shock and the lobotomy. We should have like a happy, wonderful. We should treat people like with mental illness like beyond like the extremes of the past, and unfortunately we still don't have that. The next chapter is about Harry Gold, a chemist who became a spy for the USSR from the 1930s until the 1950s, and he absolutely loved chemistry. He kind of turned to spying because the Great Depression, it's hard to find work or even to get work which like pays like enough to support yourself and your family. And he was like basically sucked in so deep. He didn't particularly want to do this, but like money is money, even though he tried to get out several times, and he just keeps getting drawn back in. And then eventually he was busted and named names, and he went to jail, got out early, and he like still distinguished himself as a brilliant chemist while he was a prisoner, and that kind of helped to lead to his early release. And they were all happy he was like being released because, oh, this is a great guy, and he like continued his like chemical research after he got out. So sometimes like people who are talented scientists, unfortunately they just get drawn into the wrong things in life, but they obviously can redeem themselves later. The next chapter is about the Unabomber, whom I'm assuming most people are very familiar with that story as well. And it opens with like saying, there was this method of interrogation at Cambridge in 1960 may have been helped to turn him into like the psycho he became. And there was this guy named Henry Murray doing the experiment. It was basically just like really, really abusive. It was just beyond like a normal psychological experiment. As obviously many people are familiar with other kind of like iffy, like ethically dubious psychological experiments of that era before we like understood as many things as we do now. And so anyway, it was like basically advertises, oh, we'll have some friendly debates and you'll get some money, which obviously the Unabomber really could have needed. But these like so-called debates just turned like into mocking this person's views and like really like angry fights and just horrible things like that. It's just a whole exploration of what made him turn bad. Did this like really like flip the switch and make him even worse? And like the whole like exploration of like psychological torture and what that can do to a person's brain. The next chapter was a story which is very, very familiar to me. It's about Dr. John Money and his like disgusting, unethical experiment on David Reimer and his twin brother Brian. If you don't know, David was born a normal boy, but unfortunately there was like a little medical condition. He and his brother were taken to be circumcised when they were 8 months old, and it went horribly wrong. They used an electrical needle instead of the usual like scalpel, and basically it was like his genitals were basically burned to a crisp. It was just like a little like black string that like broke off in pieces, and this was absolutely horrible. But then the parents didn't know what to do, and then they saw Dr. Money on Canadian TV one night with a transsexual who's like a sex reassignment operation he had performed. They said, oh, there's new hope. And like Dr. Money was one of the founders of basically like gender theory and things like that. He said, oh, if you like switch around a child early enough, they'll never know they used to be born like this biological sex. And they like basically just took their boy, and he like had like a reassignment surgery, and he was renamed like a girl named Brenda. But the experiment never worked. Like deep down he always knew he was male, even though like they weren't telling him anything. Like for example, he would like stand up to urinate, and he would do more stereotypically male things. And like Dr. Money was constantly bringing the twins in for like simulated sex play, and like that he forced them to look at one another's genitals and just asking them all these like really, really creepy questions. It was so horrible. The twins like did not want to see him again. It was just on so many levels. And if you're interested, I wrote a blog post, I think it was like 3,000-ish words on the blog Fourth Wave Now a few years ago about David Reimer. So I'll leave a link to that below if you want to check it out. And like the one thing I wasn't so keen on in this one chapter, there's a little footnote claiming the word transsexual is outdated and was only used in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, that was the only word I had ever heard used for these people until like 2015. And like tell that to like elders like Buck Angel, who's on channel I also highly recommend. They still use that word for themselves, but obviously that's a whole like thing like for another video. That's like a political thing these days, like the terminology people choose to use, like, you know, old school versus new school. And so anyway, the final chapter is the only one about a woman, Annie Dulhan, and she faked thousands of drug tests. Like they were lauding her as superwoman. Oh, she's speeding through like hundreds or tens of thousands of tests a year. Like how is she, you know, doing this? And people eventually started to get suspicious. Like what kind of human could keep up this pace? And not only did she fake all these, you know, drug tests, she ended up sending many innocent people to jail. She would basically just like make a guess based on the police reports, which, you know, many times the police were right because like they know what they're doing, particularly if they're experiencing like drug busts, or sometimes, oh, this looks like cocaine, so therefore it must be cocaine. And when, you know, colleagues' tests would contradict her, she would run a second test on a real sample of the drug claimed. Like sometimes she would like fish it out of the garbage can or things like that. And one of the reasons people started to get suspicious is because like she just isn't throwing enough things away. Like where are all the slides for her research and her tests, like in the garbage can? Like she eventually, you know, went to jail. And the author points out, like correctly, like more men than women are doing crimes like this because we, like according to sex, there are like patterns of offending. Like for example, like statistically at least, obviously most men don't do this, but statistically most men commit violent crimes and women commit, you know, like so-called like gentler crimes like this. For like obviously that's again like reasons way too long to get into here. And I had bookmarked a little thing about Ms. Dulhan. As a result, innocent people went to jail. One man was arrested with inositol, a white powder sold as a health supplement. Dulhan nailed him for cocaine. In another case, a drug addict tried to pull a rather foolhardy scam and sell a fragment of cashew to a fellow hophead, claiming it was crack. The hophead turned out to be an undercover cop. Still, it was just cashew, no big deal. The man then watched, stunned, as Dulhan swore in court to the contrary. I knew she was lying about running the tests, he later said. Ain't no way, no how a cashew can turn into crack. Not everyone Dulhan lied about went to jail. Low-level drug offenders often didn't. But drug convictions have consequences beyond prison terms. You can get deported or fired or kicked out of public housing. You can lose your driver's license or the right to see your children. If you appear in court again, you're also a repeat offender. The book wraps up by exploring some potential future scientific and ethical crimes, like, for example, murder on Mars or outer space, where there, at least in the present, there are no real laws. And he like examines like, oh, if you kill someone and this has really happened, like in the Arctic or like scientific islands which are under the jurisdiction of no nation, like where are you going to be prosecuted, or will you be prosecuted at all? Have you like committed a murder in the one place on Earth where you can like totally walk away with it without any consequences? Or for example, people might plant reconstructed DNA. They'll like creeps like rifle through your rubbish bin and they'll like fish out, you know, like tissues or something. Oh, I'll find some DNA on this, and then I'll like turn this into like a whole like DNA, like a blood sample, and I'll plant that at a crime scene and have you arrested even though you're innocent. Or maybe like start a fire by turning on someone's oven remotely, or self-driving cars ramming into people, or just like all sorts of, you know, like horrible things, like kind of like the stuff of dystopian nightmares. And I really liked how each chapter has like a themed symbol between each section. Like for example, like a bomb, a bolt of lightning, a syringe, mushroom cloud, like bones, grave. That was like totally awesome. And like the final chapter has like multiple, and I'm sorry, the appendix, and has multiple different little symbols, like, you know, DNA and computers and stuff. That was like really, really fun. I absolutely loved that. I would love to know where he like found all these like cute little symbols. And although one like minor critique I had of the book, he did have a kind of casual tone, like obviously not throughout the entire book, but sometimes like he would use like curse words, or just like, you know, a slang word, or like a casual tone. I know that's kind of a trend now, but I don't really like it. I think you should have like a professional tone instead of trying to sound like, oh, I'm so cool and hip. But other than that tiny little pedantic nitpick, I really, really enjoyed this book, and I would highly recommend it to you guys if you like you know, scientific history and like, you know, doctors and scientists behaving badly. Thank you very much for watching. If you've not already, please consider subscribing and liking and hitting the notification bell so you can know when I upload my next videos. And I also particularly love seeing comments from my viewers and subscribers because I just want to become more friends with you guys. And my next video will be talking about this great book I read, Unmasked Alice by Rick Emerson. It's a takedown of the fraud, Dr. Beatrice Sparks. I absolutely hate this woman. She was like a vile monster, and this book shows she was even viler than I already thought by making up all these diaries and ruining a real family's life. And I will also be doing an upcoming future video about my nano experience this time. Thankfully, I redeemed myself and won. And thank you guys again very much for watching. I'll see you very soon. Thanks. Bye.